The cold air inside the bomber felt heavier than usual as it pressed against every breath. Charlie Brown took his hands tightened around the controls of the B-17. The engines roared, but their sound was uneven, broken like the aircraft itself. Moments ago everything had gone wrong. Flak had exploded around them, tearing metal apart. Bullets had ripped through the nose. The tail gun was silent and one of his crew lay wounded, bleeding quietly in the back of the plane. This mission was supposed to be routine. Drop the bombs, turn back, return home, but the sky over Germany had decided otherwise. Now the bomber was alone, falling behind its formation, drifting like a wounded animal in enemy territory. Brown knew what that meant. A lone bomber was a dead bomber. He tried to steady the aircraft, but every vibration reminded him how close they were to losing control. He looked back at his crew, young faces, pale eyes wide with fear. None of them spoke, because they all understood the truth. German fighters would come any second, and when they did there would be no escape. Above them the winter clouds moved slowly, hiding and revealing patches of blue sky. Below them was enemy land filled with guns waiting to finish the job. Brown whispered a quiet prayer, not for himself but for the men who trusted him to bring them home. Far away at a German airfield, Franz Stigler prepared his Messerschmitt. His aircraft was clean, sharp, ready for combat. He had already earned respect as a skilled fighter pilot, and today promised another opportunity. Alarms had sounded. Reports came in of damaged enemy bombers retreating. Stigler climbed into the cockpit. His training took over automatically. His mission was clear: intercept, destroy, protect the homeland. As his fighter lifted into the sky he felt the familiar rush of power and focus. This was what he had been trained for. This was war. He scanned the sky until he saw it, a lone American B-17 flying low, trailing smoke, struggling to stay airborne. It was an easy kill. Stigler pushed his plane forward, closing the distance fast. He positioned himself behind the bomber, perfectly lining up his guns. His finger hovered over the trigger. One short burst and it would all be over, but as he drew closer something caught his eye. Holes torn through the fuselage, shattered glass, frozen guns, and then he saw the crew. He could see them clearly, young men moving slowly, trying to help each other. He could see the tail gunner slumped, unmoving, and in that instant the bomber stopped being a target. Stigler remembered words spoken long ago by a commander he respected: you fight with honor, you never shoot a defenseless enemy. Those words echoed louder than the engine around him. The bomber could not fight back. Destroying it would not be victory, it would be execution. Inside the B-17, Brown suddenly sensed movement beside them. He turned his head and saw the German fighter so close he could almost reach out and touch it. His heart dropped. He expected gunfire any second. He braced himself for the impact that would end everything. The crew froze, waiting for death, but it did not come. Instead the fighter stayed there, matching their speed, holding position. Brown stared at the pilot inside the enemy plane, unable to understand what was happening. Then the German pilot raised his hand and made gestures pointing downward, signaling Brown to land, to surrender. Brown shook his head violently. Landing meant capture, and he feared what would happen to his wounded crew. Stigler realized the Americans were trying to reach home, and in that moment he faced a decision that would define his life. He could fire and be celebrated, or he could protect them and risk execution for treason. Slowly, deliberately, Stigler moved his fighter into a new position, flying beside the bomber, using his own aircraft as a shield, guiding it away from German anti-aircraft zones. Below, ground crews saw a German fighter escorting the bomber and assumed it was under control. They did not fire. Brown began to understand the impossible truth: the enemy pilot was saving them. The two aircraft flew together through hostile skies, neither firing, neither speaking, bound by an unspoken agreement. As they reached the edge of German territory, Stigler looked one last time at the American crew. He raised his hand in salute, then pulled away, disappearing into the clouds. Brown watched him go, knowing he had just witnessed something rare in war, something human. The bomber limped on, barely surviving, and somehow made it back to base, crashing onto the runway. But alive, the crew survived that day because one man chose mercy over orders, and though the war would continue and countless others would die, this moment would remain frozen in time, a reminder that even in the darkest skies humanity can still appear. The bomber continued its slow journey toward home, but the danger was far from over. Charlie Brown kept his eyes on the instruments, knowing the aircraft was barely surviving. Every engine vibrated unevenly and the damaged wings struggled to hold steady. Inside the cabin the crew moved carefully, helping the wounded and securing loose equipment. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by engine noise and short urgent commands. None of them spoke about what had just happened, but every man was thinking the same thing. An enemy pilot had spared their lives. That thought felt unreal, like a dream that could vanish at any moment. Brown forced himself to focus because one mistake could still kill them. Far below, German territory slowly disappeared beneath the clouds miles away. Franz Stigler landed his fighter at the base, his aircraft untouched, his mission officially incomplete. Other pilots celebrated successful kills, but Stigler avoided conversation. He knew what he had done would never appear In any report, shooting down the bomber would have brought praise, but mercy brought only risk. Yet inside he felt no shame. He remembered the faces inside the bomber and believed he had done what was right back in the B-17. Exhaustion began to take over. Adrenaline faded and pain surfaced. The wounded crewmen were weak but alive. The bomber crossed into safer airspace, and for the first time hope felt real. But fate was not finished with them. Fuel was dangerously low and one engine began to fail. Brown prepared for an emergency landing. As the coastline came into view, the aircraft descended fast. The landing was brutal. Metal screamed, tires burst, and sparks flew as the bomber slid across the runway before stopping. Suddenly silence followed, then shouting. Ground crews ran toward the wreckage expecting the worst, but instead they found survivors climbing out, shaken, wounded but alive. Officers questioned Brown about how the plane survived German airspace. He explained the escorting fighter, but many doubted his story. War had taught them that enemies did not show mercy. The report was filed and the crew was sent to recover. Time moved on. The war continued and new missions replaced old memories. Yet Brown never forgot the German pilot who chose humanity over duty. Years later, long after the war ended, that memory pushed Brown to search for the man who saved his crew. He believed the story mattered not because it was heroic but because it proved something simple. Even in war, a single choice could change many lives. Time moved slowly after the landing, and the days that followed felt unreal for Charlie Brown and his crew. The damaged bomber sat silent on the airfield like a wounded survivor, and every time Brown looked at it he remembered how close they had come to dying. Medical teams treated the injured and the crew was ordered to rest, but sleep did not come easily. Whenever Brown closed his eyes he saw the German fighter flying beside them, close enough to touch. The face of the enemy pilot stayed clear in his mind, calm, focused and human. During the official debrief, officers asked questions about enemy defenses, flak positions and fighter patterns. When Brown spoke about the German pilot who escorted them, many in the room exchanged doubtful looks. Some believed stress had confused his memory, while others simply wrote it off as imagination. War reports had no place for mercy. The incident was quietly ignored and the mission was filed away as another damaged bomber that somehow returned. For Franz Stigler the days were filled with tension. Every time an officer walked past him he wondered if someone had seen his actions in the sky. Escorting an enemy bomber was considered treason and punishment would be immediate. He said nothing to anyone and carried the secret alone. At night he replayed the moment again and again, questioning his decision, but each time he reached the same answer: he could not shoot defenseless men. The war continued and missions piled up on both sides. Brown flew again, but something inside him had changed. He no longer saw the enemy as faceless machines. He knew now that behind every cockpit glass was another human being with fears, memories and choices. The crew often spoke quietly about that flight, especially the wounded men who knew they owed their lives to a stranger in the sky. Years later the war ended and life moved forward, but the memory refused to fade. Brown built a family and career, yet the unanswered question stayed with him. Who was that pilot and why? What became of him? Decades passed before Brown decided to search. He wrote letters, attended veteran meetings and spoke to historians, hoping someone would recognize the story. He believed finding the pilot was not about gratitude alone but about preserving truth. When the connection was finally made years later, the meeting was emotional beyond words. Two former enemies stood face to face, not as soldiers but as men bound by one moment of mercy. They spoke for hours, sharing memories and understanding that the sky had given them a story meant to be remembered. After their meeting, the bond between Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler grew stronger with time. What had started as a silent moment in the sky became a lifelong connection on the ground. They wrote letters regularly, sharing memories that only they could understand. Brown spoke about the fear inside the bomber and Stigler spoke about the pressure of being a fighter pilot ordered to kill without hesitation. Each letter revealed how close both men had come to losing everything. Brown learned that Stigler had risked execution for his choice, and Stigler learned that the bomber crew had spoken about him for years as a guardian angel in the sky. Their families became part of the story as well, listening quietly as the two men explained how war had tried to turn them into enemies but failed. At veteran gatherings, Brown often told the story publicly, and each time the audience reacted with disbelief. Many had never heard of mercy in aerial combat. Historians began taking interest and slowly the story spread beyond personal memory into documented history. Stigler remained humble and never called himself a hero. He said he only followed what his heart told him was right. Brown agreed and reminded people that courage is not always found in pulling a trigger but sometimes in choosing not to. As years passed, both men aged and their meetings became fewer but more meaningful. They knew time was limited and every conversation mattered. When Stigler's health began to decline, Brown stayed close in contact, often reminding him that his decision had saved more than lives, it had saved faith in humanity. Stigler passed away first, leaving behind letters, photographs and a legacy of honor. Brown mourned him not as a former enemy but as a brother. He spoke about Stigler whenever he could, determined that the story would not be forgotten. Brown himself lived many more years, always carrying the memory of that flight. When he finally passed, the story did not end because it had already been shared with the world. Their children and grandchildren continued telling it, ensuring that future generations would understand what happened above Germany on that cold day. The sky that once held violence had also held compassion. In a war defined by destruction, 2 pilots proved that a single decision could rise above orders, ideology and fear. Their story remains a reminder that humanity can survive even in the most unforgiving places.